Hello and welcome to our video presentation for NWAV 49. My name is Emily Sadler-Brown and my co-authors, Hayani Salas and Isabel Salomon, and I will be talking today about our recent work examining a potential sound change in Pirahã. Previous studies have found that it is women who generally lead sound change. But before going in any further, I'll add several important caveats. First, it's not the case that women are the leaders in every case of sound change. There are plenty of cases of male-led change, and the effect of gender is different at different stages of change. And furthermore, gender often doesn't have an across-the-board effect. It can and does interact with other variables like socioeconomic status, age, and social group. But despite these added complexities, the gender generalization is a recurring statement in the socio-literature. There's enough of a pattern to merit a qualified generalization. And this is that women, that is the people whom the analyze has identified as women, tend to be the leaders of sound changes. But even this qualified generalization has been based mainly on studies of large urban majority languages. A growing body of work from smaller and/or rural and/or indigenous societies is revealing a more mixed picture of gender-related patterns and the role of gender in sound change. In some cases, like Clark 2009, working with speakers of Innu Aimun in Labrador, Canada, women are seen to be leading in the advancement of a shift towards a prestige variety. But in other cases, gender seems to be a poor predictor of variation, as Skilton 2017 showed, working with Mahiki speakers in the Amazon of northeastern Peru. Our goal today is to add to this picture by asking, do women lead a potential sound change in Pirahã?
The Pirahã are a society of around 700 people who live by the river Maici in Amazonas, Brazil. Their territory is 342,000 hectares large, so it's a relatively large territory. And there are about 10 villages, so the villages are hours or even days apart from each other by boat. Our field work was conducted in the village of Piquiá, which is approximately 170 kilometers away from Humaitá, the closest town. And the Pirahã will often do a trip to the Trans-Amazonica Road when they want access to goods they get in exchanges with local settlers. This is not a very populated region, though. The settlement in the picture is not very different from what villages look like, and the contact with Pirahã with non-Pirahã outsiders is done through a pidgin that mixes Yengatu, Portuguese, and Pirahã words. This is used by men and understood by several women, though they will avoid contact with non-Pirahã, so they either not reply or when they do, it's in Pirahã. The main social institutions are families and family clans. More than one clan can live in the same village, but eventually a clan can get too big and move to another site to form other villages. People also move from one village to another for marriage, and that is true of both men and women. There's no official leadership in the society, no apparent class system. The main subsistence comes from fishing. Childcare responsibilities are mostly women's, but men help too. And in fact, there's quite a bit of overlap in the activities performed by men and women. So for example, women fish and hunt if they choose to. The domestic chores are shared, and both men and women do traditional crafts, such as beading or basket making. There is no school. So essential activities, for example, canoeing, swimming, fishing, are learned from parents and peers. So in the picture, you see kids with their arrows and bows fitted to their sizes, so they're practicing. There's no written language, no standard language or norm-imposing institutions. Muda was once an isolate language with two dialects, the one spoken by the Muda people and the one spoken by the Pirahã people. The Muda people currently speak only Brazilian Portuguese, so that makes Pirahã the last surviving Muda language. UNESCO classifies Pirahã as vulnerable. Although it is spoken by all generations, the small population and growing influence of Portuguese in their contact suggests a relatively high risk of endangerment. We have Muda word lists from 1950 that provide us with Pirahã Muda cognates, and this connection with Muda is important as we are using reconstruction data in our analysis of S variation. Both S and H are phonemes in Pirahã and Muda, as you can see in the highlighted word, the word for meat, in the table. The change in progress that we are analyzing targets that what we call historical S. So this change is a gender-mediated variation that has been observed by field workers, starting with Everett, who says, in female speech, S goes to H before I and optionally elsewhere. So in one, for example, Essegehe would be pronounced by men, and women would pronounce the same word as Ehegehe. For 2 and 3, it would be optional for women to use A or B. We present the first quantitative variationist analysis of S variation in Pirahã, and our first goal is to characterize gender variation in the realization of S by determining the frequencies of both genders' usage of S in all 3 possible environments. Our second goal is to establish whether S variation likely represents a change in progress. Addressing these goals allows us to ask, do women lead this potential change in Pirahã?
This data was collected from 6 participants, 3 females and 3 males, spanning from the ages of 20 to 90. The ages are estimates from healthcare professionals. The participants are connected to each other in various ways, including familial, friendship, and geographical ties. This is a repurposed data from a 2013 trip in order to collect phonetic description of the data, which is why there is a limited number of participants. Bureaucratic barriers have so far barred us from going and collecting more data. The female speakers were collected by Salles, the male speakers were collected by another researcher, Silva, although both were present in all the citations. The participants were asked to name picture prompts on a computer screen. They named what they saw, and with reps and synonyms, there were 2,368 word tokens with a range of 204 to 601 words per speaker. We identified S variant if an S-like or H-like articulation was given in the pre-vocalic environment. If even one speaker used an S-like or H-like articulation pre-vocalically in a particular word, that word was coded for all speakers and all repetitions. We then matched them with the closest IPA symbol. For exclusions, we excluded mumbled and not clearly audible tokens. We also excluded morphemes that could historically contain H. We were interested in variation in segments that were historically S, but remember, Pirahã has an H phoneme too. We needed to eliminate these historical H segments so as not to artificially raise the number of H variants we found. We identified probable morphemes that are historically H if all speakers used H in all reps of a word, and if available in our Mura list, we double-checked against it to make sure its cognate did not reconstruct to S in Mura. Interestingly, this never happened. Every word that was all H in our data was written as H in Mura when available. We found a lot of variation in the data. For example, the word chin has 7 different ways of saying it. Even just the relevant segment has multiple variants to it, and speakers even varied which variant they used on repetitions. So much so, in fact, that we found 19 different phones and 0 in the studied environment. So there was a lot more variation that we were expecting. Looking at the distribution of this chart, we can see the phones group around the alveolar S and glottal H regions, which suggests 2 principal categories for S variation. We also found that the phones were much more similar to each other than these discrete IPA symbols would suggest, such as the alveolar fricatives, which were remarkably similar to each other. We can also see that phones that do not center around these areas are mostly in our oldest speaker, which could be due to a lack of teeth or other markers of age, as she might have not been aiming at that specific articulatory target. For these reasons, we decided to group these phones into S-like, H-like, and other for this analysis, and that's how we refer to these categories from now on. So this first table is for the proportion of H use before the vowel I. We're expecting H use for women and non-H use in men. However, we can see that women have higher rates than men, although they are not overtly not too high, and are fairly low in our 2 oldest speakers. However, men do use some H. This table is for the alternation environment before the vowel A. Women's H rates are higher than men's, but men still use H. Our oldest speaker still has fairly low rates. Here we have the table for the alternation before O. It's important to note that there are less words in this environment on our data, as the original data did not balance this for the purposes we are using it for. But we can still see that women have higher rates of H than men, and that the youngest male still uses H. Here we have a summary graph with the results of all three environments. As we can see from the top 3 bars in each group, women have a higher H use than men. It's also interesting to note that the highest rates for women are actually in the pre-A environment, not in the pre-I as we were expecting.
Our second goal was to determine whether S variation represents a sound change in progress. To address this, we sought out sources of independent evidence for change involving S and H, and we were able to identify 3 pieces of evidence that are consistent with the change in progress. First, field worker observations. From Everett's observations in the 80s to 2013, when our data was collected, to Hayani's more recent observations in Pirahã, suggest an increase in the overall frequency and linguistic environments of the H variant. In men, it looks like what was once S, according to Everett in the 80s, is variable in our 2013 data, and most recently, Hayani has noted widespread H usage in young men especially. For women, Everett's claim was that women use H before I and optionally in other environments. What we saw is that women's H use is variable, so not as consistent as Everett claimed, but our data did indicate H has become widespread in what seems to be the newer environment, the pre-A environment. So this increase in frequency for men and in environments for women is consistent with an S to H change in progress. Second, we checked all our variable words, the words that were sometimes offered with S and sometimes with H, and identified all probable cognates in the 1950 Mura word list. Of the 9 variable word cognates we were able to identify, all of these were written as S in Mura. And in the little chart here, you can see an example of a variable word in Pirahã with all its variants, and that this is written with the S in Mura. And this was true of all our other variable words. So again, this is consistent with a scenario in which segments that are currently variable in Pirahã were pronounced S in the past. And finally, we point to a suggestive age pattern in our own data. Our youngest speaker, F20, uses by far the highest frequency of H. So although our evidence doesn't guarantee that S variation is a change in progress, our 3 pieces of evidence are consistent with what we'd expect from a change of progress from S to H. And we note also that S to H would be the expected direction of change. To summarize, we've shown that in our data, women use more H than men, and we've shown that this variation likely represents a change in progress, with H being the newer variant. With these 2 pieces of evidence, we're in a position to ask whether women are leading this potential change in progress. And the answer seems to be yes, they are. And this is the same pattern that has been found in many studies of large urban majority societies, despite very different cultural circumstances. So although we've suggested we've answered our question, there's of course a larger one. Why do we find this pattern? In the last few minutes, we wanted to go through some of the most common explanations for why women often lead sound change in large urban societies and think about how these themes might apply in Pirahã society. The 3 we'll focus on are patterns of social interaction, prestige, and power. Our discussion here is necessarily brief, but we'll be able to make some initial links between previous interpretations and how they might apply or not in Pirahã. Some previous research has explained a particular group's lead in sound change by who that group speaks to, or the circumstances of those interactions. For example, one group might be connected by weak ties to a group of speakers outside the community, ties that serve as conduits for change within the community. So the question is, do women in Pirahã use H more than men because they are speaking more to other H users inside or outside the village? Or do they have ties to another community that men don't have?
We think the answer is no, or at least not obviously so. Women have similar amounts of contact with women and men and strong ties with women and men within the village. They also seem to spend the same amount of time in the village and elsewhere as men. So for example, in those temporary settlements, gender mixed groups will travel together. And women seem to have equal strength of ties and amount of contact with Pirahã from other villages as men. So patterns of social interaction do not seem to explain why women lead this change.
If women's lead in this change cannot be attributed to who women speak to, then maybe it has something to do with how the variants are evaluated by Pirahã society. Previous researchers, most famously Lebov, 1966, in his work in New York City, have observed women to be quicker adopters of incoming prestige norms. So in our work, we asked whether H might represent such a norm.
Again, we think the answer is no, or at least not obviously so. No standard dialect is apparent. S is not generally talked about or talked about in reference to a particular group, and S does not seem to be negatively evaluated and does not seem to be subject to style shift. So H does not seem to be an incoming prestige norm. Our change behaves more like a change from below.
Finally, a pervasive theme in explanations for women leading sound change is power. To quote Eckert, 1989, women deprived of access to real power must claim status through the use of symbols of social membership. Although we aren't able to speak to the symbolic status of H, we can ask whether we've seen evidence for gender-based power imbalances in Pirahã that might provide the cultural environment for women leading sound change.
Well, this one needs more thought. So with regards to gender roles, there's overlap in the activities performed by men and women. So for example, women may fish and hunt. Domestic chores are shared, as I said before. Women sometimes beat men for infidelity or not being able to bring fish home. So that suggests some agency, or at least that they are not powerless. The social organization is relatively egalitarian. There's no traditional hierarchical organization or positions of power for women to be excluded from. However, only men talk to outsiders, and they enjoy more access to resources they bring in. Men are the main providers of food for women in the family, so are women reliant on them? And men are more active in conflicts with outsiders, suggesting women and children rely on them for protection. So power imbalance may be a relevant factor.
So perhaps not surprisingly, none of the explanations apply straightforwardly in the Pirahã context. What we have is a female-led sound change in the absence of any obvious explanatory factors. So then what is the reason? Well, we're not able to offer any concrete suggestions at this point, but we can speculate on some directions for future work. First, men's relationships with outsiders and women's lack of relationship to outsiders, aside from having a potential role in the power differences between men and women, might also reflect or affect men's and women's Pirahã identity. Women display other outward signs of Pirahã cultural orientation, for example, in wearing traditional handmade dresses, while men will wear clothes given to them by outsiders. So maybe cultural identity is what H is indexing and not gender per se. On the other hand, Everett, 1985, has described men avoiding the use of certain sounds around outsiders. So maybe men's use of S reflects efforts to be conservative around foreigners, efforts which might be heightened in the elicitation environment. For their part, women seem to care less to adjust their behavior around outsiders, and sometimes don't even acknowledge their presence at all. All of this is speculation, of course, but in future work, we plan to do more ethnographic work to identify factors that the Pirahã themselves find important. We'll also be considering some of the variables that others have identified as being important in small indigenous societies. Factors like clan, place of birth and upbringing, and kinship and co-residence ties. In conclusion, we've identified a potential female-led sound change, S to H lenition in Pirahã, the same pattern as is commonly found in large urban societies. Yet explanations developed to explain the pattern in these societies cannot be imported directly into the Pirahã cultural context. We've suggested some factors to look at in future research, but we also want to stress that finding the same pattern might indicate the same explanation. So it will be important to consider those aspects of gender culture that might be shared by the two contexts, and consider that locally important variables may represent more general factors. That is, whatever explains why women lead this potential sound change in Pirahã may have explanatory power even beyond the Pirahã context.
We'd like to thank everyone who helped us in this project, including the Pirahã participants, and all of you for watching our presentation. Finally, here are our references if you'd like to take a look. Thank you so much.
Thank you.